Hi, everyone. My name is Gail Bertrand. Welcome to this first webinar in a series about the future of social media intelligence and social media research. I'm joined today and very glad to be joined by Julian Ney, who will introduce herself in a minute, who is the UK's first doctor in social. And today, Julian and I, in conversations, will essentially go back through what has been over 10 years of social media intelligence and what it has brought to the insights industry and what might happen in the future. So welcome, Julian. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you for having me on, Gail. It's a real pleasure to be with you. So, as Gail mentioned, I'm Dr. Julian Ney, and I'm credited with being the first person in the UK to have a PhD in social media and consumer behaviour. No one's really challenged that in the past. How many years is it? Oh God, 14. It's not, maybe not quite as many as that. So we'll continue on using that one. And I now run a company called the Social Intelligence Lab, and it is a membership community for the social data analysis industry, or the social listening industry, or the social intelligence industry, whatever you choose to call it. If you work with social data, then you are very, very welcome. I bring the industry together to form best practice and to also debate the industry, and we also do a lot of training in terms of how to work through the data.
Thanks very much, Julian. So a couple of words about myself. So I actually started in social media intelligence about almost 12 years ago, stumbling upon it a little bit by coincidence, really, as I was working for a research company that has started to do ethnography. And I really loved the medium, and which is why I got into it and ended up leading social media intelligence at Kantar. Is still very much an important tool in my toolkit, which is why I wanted to share some of my experience here. So, Gillian, I think we should start with how you got into social media insight or social media intelligence in the first place. So how did you get into it?
Oh yeah, it's some people think I was the greatest mastermind in the world when they hear how early with the PhD and things like that. And it was a little bit of that and a little bit of luck. I was finishing up my undergraduate degree and I was on track for a first class honours, and the university invited me to stay on for a PhD. And at that point, I was still really young and I didn't have any real burning interest in anything. So they told me to go away and do some research and to come back with 3 trends that was going to impact the world in the next 10 years, which would give us a bit of guidance in terms of what my PhD thesis the thesis might look like. And I came back with 2 things. The first one was social data rather than social media. And the second one was about people visiting film locations and TV set locations for tourism. Because at that point, you weren't really seeing, there was just a little bit of that. And they were the 2 things that I found that interested me. I then did a small project for the university where I had to analyse volunteer voice for mega sporting events. So those events are things like the Commonwealth Games, the Olympics, and the World Cup. Back then, it had just been announced that Glasgow was going to host the 2014 Commonwealth Games. And what we discovered is that every one of these events, is up to each host city to train and recruit the volunteers for them. So the experience can vary quite differently across all of these different games that go on. So what the academics that I was working for wanted to do was create one model that could be tested in Glasgow 2014 and then replicated throughout the world after that point. My job was to understand this from the point of view of the volunteers themselves, but like everything, there is always no budget. So I had to figure out a way to get their experiences without being able to fly out to Beijing or anything like that. And at that time, I started Googling and using the forums and the blogs that was there and the little bit of social media that was present, and painted a real picture of what these people go through when they're being trained and when they're working at all of these big different events. And that really cemented in the fact that there was power in social data for me, and that it's been my life ever since.
That's really interesting, because we seem to have started from very similar places where we kind of both started working on the medium and working on it by essentially gathering the data just by looking on the internet. Mm-hmm. How do you think things have changed and the practice potentially evolved when tools that were gathering content en masse were introduced? How do you think that changed things?
So this is going to be quite controversial, and I work with a lot of the different vendors that are in the industry. But if I'm 100% honest, and they do a great job of helping us get to different data sources and things like that. But if I'm perfectly honest, as a researcher, I don't think that they help us that much. If we've got standard things that we want to do in brands, like kind of brand tracking and like there's people tracking campaigns and other things like that, then yeah, they can be very helpful. But when, as researchers, if we've got a complex question to go in and analyze, then the functionality of the technology doesn't really help support that journey for us. And it means that we need to do a lot of it manually, where we're maybe using the technologies to gather the data and then exporting the data and analysing it in another way. So it's great that there's been this wide acceptance now of social data. And whenever anybody speaks about the industry, they talk about what tool do you use? And I think that we need to start getting away from that, because the tool is only as powerful as the person who's using it. So there's a lot of training and things needed in terms of how to go about structuring questions, segmenting and analysing the data. And I think that that's largely missing from the market just now.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I don't think it's such a controversial point of view. Or at least I have a similar point of view, which our tools are about, and that's not why you're here today. Really, it's I think it's something that people who work and have a research process about using the data feel the same about, where the tools are only ever a means to an end. And actually, I recall a webinar I did actually on NewMR a few years ago, I think 6 years ago, where I was talking about humans and machines working together. And I firmly believe that. I think the tools are just are a means to an end to collect the data and do some of the heavy lifting if you can. But do you think that having the tools has kind of influenced people's perception? I'm actually asking you a leading question, but how do you feel that the fact that we're using tools has kind of influenced and potentially limited people in their use of social data?
Oh, I think it's massively influenced and massively impacted them. And you just need to speak to a person that's tried to use it. So everything is great when we go through all of the different demos and things like that. And the trouble comes when you go to use it for the first time and it's just not as intuitive as what you were shown, or you go and you look at it and the data quality is extraordinarily poor. And then you get quite frustrated. And the thing that nobody tells you really is that even data scientists, they probably spend about 80% of their time cleaning up the data. But when it comes to social data, you just expect to be able to go and type in a few things and then everything's hunky-dory and you can work through that. You still need to clean the data. It's a horrible job. It takes a long time. And I think that can put people off. And it's certainly not something that's spoken about a lot when you're going through a sales process to buy a technology.
So there's a perception that social media data, because it's almost ubiquitous, is easy to access. And actually, it's easy to access. And what I mean by easy to access is it's easy to get hold of, and it's ready, and it's in a format and you can analyze it straight away.
And it's free.
And it's free. That's it as well. And the other misconception, I guess, is that it's free, it's freely available, and also it's, you don't have to do much to answer the questions that you need to answer.
I think there's something else that we need to talk about, like raise at this point as well, is that because these tools have various different functionalities in them, and they've got various metrics that they measure and things that they do automatically, like share of voice or sentiment and things like that, it places more importance on those metrics when people go in and they can just get them readily. And actually, if we're using this as researchers to understand something, then there's a conflict, because those easy to access measures are not the things that we want to see. We want to go deeper into the data. So there's quite a bit of conflict in there. And it means then that if you don't question it and go beyond what the functionality is, then you're being led by the platform on an analysis. And it's not probably, I would 99% of the time, or 99.9% of the time, going to give you the answer that you're looking for. So you need to kind of a lot of the time dig a bit deeper and go beyond the functionality of what is readily available and start to really read the data, segment the data and make sense of it, than just being led by what the platform can do.
The performance, measurement, evaluation angle, which the tools give you, really, which is what they're built for, is at times skewing what people feel is important about the data. And again, if you want a resource around best practice around social media, Ray Pointer, who leads NewMR, and I contributed to the paper, was leading an initiative around measuring, not counting, with the IPA, which kinds of provides some best practice around how to approach social media. So I would encourage you to have a look at that. It's interesting what you're saying here, because in some ways, the way that social media started being used as a tool is possibly because it was in the context of social media marketing, and that the tools were built to do analytics on campaigns rather than necessarily being built for researchers to be able to answer specific questions. So possibly that has skewed people. I'd like to move on a little bit from tools and really talk about a little bit more of how you feel, not necessarily the use of tool, but the practice has evolved really, and how people have gone about essentially finding their way a little bit in the dark about what this methodology is.
I think you're right there in saying people finding their way in the dark. When people come to speak to me about what it is that they're doing and the methodologies that they're creating, and actually now there is quite a lot of people going and building out their own unique methodologies for this. One of the first things is they said, we just had to test and learn. We were making it up, but this is where we've got to. We've been able to find some great things, but I don't know if this is a similar way to how other people are doing it, or if this is completely wrong. And it's almost like you're marking their homework almost. And don't get me wrong, it's a great trusted place for me to sit and to be able to engage with these people, to see their processes and things like that. But I think there is a little bit of a worry that they're not quite doing it right. But many times everything is great. It's just that they have had nothing to compare it to before.
Yeah. And that's fair, and there is more literature and blogs being written around the practice of social media listening or social media intelligence now than ever before, I think. So I mean, the key is that almost all of these blogs, except for, what's being done on the Scilab, are often written by organizations with a commercial interest in the sector. So I don't know how people feel about, how independent their view of the world is. But it's true that there are more blogs and more resources being put out there.
Definitely. Yeah, I think that's one of the other issues really here. I don't want to take us back to tools, but because the industry was largely born out of all of these technology companies, so it's people trying to sell technology, and there's always been that very strong commercial application for it. And all of the blogs and all of the content and everything's been then therefore generated by all of those organizations. I think that there's, for people looking at it from the outside, there's a real lack of, I would say, lack of trust there, because they've all got skin in the game. And it's not necessarily, it tends to be talk like product marketing rather than talking about this is a discipline, which is, I think, where we differ, and we want to really push forward the agenda that there is a discipline here.
I've noticed in the last few years that there's been an increasing focus on using social media as a source of insight around audiences. Why do you think the audience focus has kind of shifted in the last, or has kind of shifted to audiences in the last few years, when at the beginning audiences were kind of something that you kind of didn't really talk about because you were almost scared of people thinking that social media wasn't representative? So what do you think has helped with increasing the focus on the audience part?
I think that a lot of that, I can remember doing some of the early projects and people always asking about, but are these people relevant to me? And I think that there's been quite a bit of push internally as people have been developing audiences and just really starting to think about what all of this means, and the fact that they want more information on the audience. I think that there's been a spurt of technology companies in that area as well. And it's people, they want to know about being able to build audiences. So again, if we're thinking about it from a researcher's point of view, a lot of the development in here is maybe not necessarily for the researcher, but for those marketing teams and social media teams to go out and build bigger, more engaged audiences. So there might be, again, a slight disconnect in terms of what the output of the technology is and what it is that we expect to have as researchers.
We've always been able to tell something, at least, about the people that are having those conversations based on the conversations they're having, even though we may not have had profiles. So for example, we would have always been able to tell from reading a conversation whether a person had a specific interest in something, right? So yeah, I think that part was kind of not really looked at or considered as much, but has come, as I said, a bit more to the forefront, because tools again have kind of come into play and kind of put that at the forefront. You were talking about the fact that obviously this practice is heavily influenced by technology. So we can't talk about technology and potentially not touch upon AI and machines as being part of this practice. So what do you feel, AI or automation is bringing to us in this practice?
Well, I like to manually analyze my social data. I like to read it. And I'm always honest. I'm always honest about that. So at my work at the Social Intelligence Lab, we work with many different types of technologies. We work with many different types of agencies who are all doing something slightly different. And I've had to really go in quite deep into AI and machine learning, and to really get my head around it because of the history of my career and the fact that I did it to answer this question, and then that was just my work all the way through. And for me, the way that I see AI machine learning fitting in is if we have a longer term study that is going to track the same thing again and again and again and again, then that is great. It can help us do a bit of heavy lifting. But if I'm going in to understand volunteer voice for mega sporting events again, it's highly unlikely that I'm going to use that approach. Or for me, I wouldn't use that approach. There's some really interesting models that are out there that can help you get to answers for different things. But I think if we're researchers and we're researching kind of one-off projects and stuff like that, I think that we're probably still more likely to use a manual approach just now.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I guess that one of the elements I've always observed when I've talked to fellow professionals who also analyze social medias is that sometimes the AI gets in the way because it gets in the way of the interpretation of the data, because people almost sort of see the AI as what the output from the machine process has given us as the output, and not necessarily interpreted it because so much effort has been put into analyzing that data.
No, I agree with you there. There's a company out there that they run the project for Twitter, which is about the kind of cultural understanding of what's happening on the platform, and they're like us, and they would manually analyze data happily, but obviously there's such big data sets and things like that, and I know that they went through to do a bit more of an approach with AI, but what they were finding is they were getting an end answer, but they didn't know what was driving it because it couldn't tell them. So they had to go back and then unpick some of this to go in and analyze it manually again to be able to understand the context of what has happened, because it spits you've got a granular answer, but you don't know what's causing it. And I think that's where the bit of a disconnect happens as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that I always told my teams when I was working previously leading analysts in this field was that you are going through a research process, and you need to ultimately answer and tell a story which matches the objectives, which means that you do need to interpret the data. I think sometimes in our practice that sometimes gets a bit lost. I'm going to come back to something that you said at the beginning, which was when you first started. You started by reading blogs and forums and some of the little social data you said that was there at the time. How there's a big question always around social media intelligence about sources and availability of sources and specific market influences which have driven people to focus on certain sources or not focus on them because they're not available. So what's your feeling about restrictions on accessing some data sources? Is it a hindrance? Is it not a hindrance? What's your feeling?
This is going to depend on the type of work that you do as well. If you speak to someone that's sitting inside a brand, they want to get access into Facebook and Instagram because that's where large audiences are. Everybody's kind of driven by the numbers game and being able to access on there. But if you're looking for high quality relevant data, those places are maybe not necessarily the ones where you want to go to. So I've never had a project where I've never been able to use social data to answer at least part of the question. I think that when we say social data, everybody automatically thinks social media sites, and everybody automatically thinks that we're using it for some kind of campaign or we're using it for social media marketing. So I think that that's quite limiting in a way. But when I talk about social data, I've always spoken about it's any digital source where people can have a conversation, basically, is how I would classify that. And there is no end of sources. It's just a case of being able to do some work and find where people are having the conversations, and they're not necessarily the places that you think that they're going to be.
Yeah, that's absolutely fair. And also there's almost a Westernized version as well of what that looks like. So when people who are, in a Western context, either in the UK or the US, are thinking about looking at social media, they'll automatically think that, other countries would be using the same social media sites. Yes. And won't necessarily, think of that the social media landscape is going to be really different. It's quite important as well to understand where conversations are taking place in the first place, and whether those conversations are relevant to your objectives.
Yes, no, definitely. The places where people tend to write more are always good, because you can get more of a context around there, instead of like kind of throwaway comments on Facebook posts or on something like that.
Yes, absolutely. And not to forget as well that when, often you have a little bit of pressure as well from stakeholders of including the latest social media network that has appeared on the market. A few years ago it was Snapchat. Now it's going to be TikTok. And I think, thinking and convincing stakeholders about whether that's relevant to answering your research objective can be a mountain to climb as well for those trying to do analysis. We're talking here about potentially, singling out sources if we want to make sure that they're relevant, and we're talking about, different sources potentially having different function in the conversation. So what's your feeling about potentially people talking about social data as a whole body of data rather than looking at what function each source potentially plays in driving the conversation?
I mean, in our certification, we have a whole module that's on data sources, and we go through different data sources and we audit them to help the students figure out what source is good for what different types of questions. And it's a really useful thing to do, because it does get them thinking about individual data sources rather than having social data as a body of data itself. We know that from some of the work that was seen and done is that different platforms have different personalities. So you're going to find something different on Tumblr as what you are to Twitter, as what you are to Reddit or Facebook or in a forum. And you can see, if you start to analyze the data sources individually, you can start to see that coming through. So if you're taking everything as a whole, then you're going to be influenced more where there's more noise, rather than influenced by the right things. So if you're taking it as a whole body of data and not really looking at it properly, then your research can be a little bit biased.
No, absolutely. Not understanding potentially the profile of people who are on interacting on those platforms, and putting that using that as a context piece as well to interpretation is something that I've often seen as missing from some of the analysis which is being conducted, which is trying to essentially put the user in context so that you can interpret it in the right way. So it's very true that it really depends on what it's a word which you use and I don't use as often, possibly the word use case. It depends on the use case that you've got. But it's true that the sources that you consider will very much depend on what you want to do with the data. And it's pretty much the same as any research process, really, where, if you want to find out a specific type of answer with traditional research, you're probably going to use, a specific methodology, either qual or quant, which and you are confident will help you answer that.
Definitely. I'm laughing because you mentioned use case, and I do use it a lot. But the reason we have to use it a lot is because when you sit at the top of an industry and you hear about how everybody is trying to use the data. I mean, at the start of the year, we held an event, and I just sitting listening to, because I was present in every single one of, I think there was maybe 19 different sessions, and I was there for every single session, and hearing the differences in what people are talking about and how they're using the data and what they're using it for and the approach to the analysis. But everybody's talking about social intelligence, but actually when you start to break it down and see what people are doing, there's many different approaches to social intelligence. And half the battle is, and people are getting upset and they're getting frustrated because they think they're talking about the same thing, but they're actually talking about something slightly different. And so I think that there's, since that event, we've been working to create new models and frameworks to help people say, okay, so this is what it is that I'm trying to do, and here's the different types of things that the things that we might want to measure, frameworks that we might want to use, and things like that to help them guide through that process. Because when they go to speak to somebody about it, that other person may sit in a different part of the business, they may use the data in a completely different way with a different approach, and you think you're talking about the same thing, but you end up missing each other. There's a difference in expectations.
We've talked quite a bit about the past, and we've talked about, the common practice. So I suppose I should go to the future now, because that's what this webinar is about. So I know this is going to be a really difficult question, but what do you feel the future holds when it comes to social media intelligence?
So I think it's really rosy, and I've started to be really mean to people, not mean, but I started to do ask some questions to people that we're speaking to, just to see where they think that the industry is going as well. And I think everybody's place is always, they think text analytics. And actually, if you see where everything is actually going in terms of all of these virtual communities, and everybody's talking about the metaverse just now and things like that, I think that the nature of the study will change slightly, because it's going to be, there's people in other places online now, and I think that the work that we do here makes us very well placed to go in and continue to analyze behaviors and things around all of those new worlds that are starting to develop online. So I think that we'll start to move more into that area, and actually I'm really excited about that. It's a slightly different method of analysis, but I think that there's a lot that we can learn.
One of the things I've noticed, and I'm sure you have, because you do share that as well, when they're available, is that I can see more jobs being advertised increasingly in the industry, and apparently, and that's a statistic that you gave me, that 48% of Fortune 100 companies have a dedicated person or team to do social media intelligence, which is quite staggering and much higher than I was expecting.
So I lost 2 weeks of my life doing that project, but it was a good one. It was a good one to do. I downloaded and made a database of all the Fortune 100 companies last year, and I was going to extend it out into the 500s, but with time and how things have moved, and I've not been able to go and pick it back up again. But I then went on to LinkedIn, and I was looking for people who were specifically social listening, social insights, social analyst, social intelligence. So I was looking for someone who is a dedicated body in the company that all they do all day is social data. And what I found was that 48% of those Fortune 100 companies either had a people or they were building a team, which I think is great. It is really, really good.
It also, I guess, fits in with something that is being talked about in the research industry at large, which is in-housing of research as well. But I guess that what that trend highlights is what we were talking about just now, which is the fact that there needs to be more formalized training and more dedicated resources, so that as those teams are being built, then they're following, a certain practice for the industry, in the same way that the research industry has built itself other practice guidelines for other methodologies.
I think that eventually the machine learning models are going to get smarter. I think that the future of that is going to be collaborations between these people that I work with that are building methodologies, and they're doing all of this by hand, and linking them up with more AI-based companies to help with that. I think there's always still going to be people involved in all of this, because we need to We can't just give the answer that it spits out. We need to interpret why something is happening, and so we're always going to be needed in that process. There's still going to be massive changes in data access, the different types of data that we get, and just ensuring that we can access data ethically.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the idea that you're bringing here is here as well is the fact that people will need to continue building frameworks to extend the use of social media data, and not limited to some of the known use cases, so that it keeps on being useful. Because otherwise, I think that people will potentially, not be able to experience it in the way it's meant to be, which is quite a free and unbridled source of data to start with, where you can imagine many ways that you can answer questions. One of the things I've seen as well is, and we're back in tools, in talking about tools here, but there's been a significant consolidation in the industry when it comes to tool companies. A lot of them merging, a lot of them being acquired specifically by PR and comm specialist entities. And I certainly feel this may actually take away from the research use case in the development of these tools, which means that we may, as researchers, carry on doing manual or using manual processes for that, because the tools may not help us, or may not develop to help us answer questions as well.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you there. It's, as a researcher in this area, it's slightly worrying, the PR focus and the companies that are buying up some of these technologies, because the use case is very, back to use case, but the use case is very different. But I think that we need. It's interesting because there's a few smaller players and people that are coming from more of a digital anthropology background that are starting to build more. They're starting to build technologies from their models and methods and how they've been using social data. So I think that maybe the types of players that we go to may change. We may not use some of these bigger behemoth social listening technologies. It might be something that's a bit more niche that we start to use.
Yeah, absolutely. Which means there's an opportunity actually out there for people who want to develop tools which are going to help researchers ultimately.
Yeah, definitely. I think that if I'm honest though, there's certain restrictions in terms of, as when we go in to do work, we may have a one-off project that lasts for 6 weeks or something like that. And to be able to access some technologies, you need to buy a year's license, which means you need to be comfortable in the fact that you're going to have enough demand for your work. So it makes it really difficult to put social data up there as a research method, particularly if you don't have continual projects and things like that. So I think that we, as a market, as an industry, we need to look at the model that it works on to be able to get more people access to the data.
That's actually really, really interesting. And it's true that we talked about tools a lot, but we know from some of the case studies that are out there, including case studies that have been shared by by organizations, that actually a lot of organizations who have the data science power don't really bother with using tools at all, that they harvest the data themselves, using APIs or using their own technology to be able to get the data that they need, rather than relying upon tools. So I guess the field in that area is wide open. You touched upon the question of ethics. You mentioned the word ethics about 10 minutes ago, and I want to come back on that. So ethics is a really important part of using social media data, which is sometimes forgotten. So we both, I think, wanted to use this platform to kind of remind people listening of what what is acceptable and what is not necessarily acceptable, and potentially some resources that you can consult if you're not sure. I think one of the things that often I have to remind people is that you cannot listen in to closed communities without declaring yourself. I think that people assume that because it's online, it's acceptable for you to create yourself a username and password and just delve into the community. Ultimately, you're there for a research process. And if you look at the various codes of conduct, including the MRS one, which is the one I go by, you would have to declare yourself. So I think that's a real one that I think I have to remind people often when I talk about this subject. Are there any other ethical points that you wanted to put to light, Julian?
I think this is a really kind of tricky area, and it's something that we've been looking at and working on for a little bit of time. And every time we think we've got somewhere with it, there's another layer of something else hiding underneath. And we hear a lot more about more legislations and things coming in terms of like GDPR and things like that. But there's other things that are happening here in the fact that we can access data beyond the APIs. So when people tell us that they've got more Facebook data or Instagram data than any other platforms and things like that, we kind of know that they're getting data in another way. But when Facebook takes them to court, it doesn't hold up in court. So there's all of these things that in terms of people want access to the data. So they're moving to try to get more access into those data sources. But is it ethical? These are some, and it would take a long time to answer all of these questions, but these are the types of questions that we're starting to ask now.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the elements that I think you, as a researcher, and before using any tool that you want to use, you need to consider is making sure that the tool that you're using is GDPR compliant. And also, when you're sharing the data, if you're sharing it with anyone, you're being GDPR compliant yourself. So, you're sharing the data in a way which doesn't infringe GDPR yourself, or you're not even infringing some of the networks. If you're using data from a network such as Twitter, you're not infringing any of their rules, or Facebook for that matter, you're not infringing any of their rules. But it's true that there's also a lack of clarity around what the best practice is. I know from looking at it, and I never remember the number of the certification, so I apologize. But I know that there is obviously now there is the new ISO certification in market research, which is 22 something. I will find it, but which has some guidance around how social media data should be used, and specifically there is some guidance in there which links to GDPR, use of data, share of data. So if you are unsure, there are resources out there to help you sort of make your own decisions and make some wise decisions if you're worried about ethical standpoints. Was there anything else that you wanted to desperately share with us, Gillian, before we go on to the Q&A?
If you're listening to this and you've maybe used social data in the past and it's not quite worked out, or if you're thinking about using social data and are maybe struggling to get started, is start small. Please go back to it if you've had a bad experience before, and just really think about building a framework to analyze the data instead of using the functionality on the platforms. And as researchers, you already have all of the skills in order to be able to make that happen. And it is a little bit fiddly, but you will be able to find your way through. And there is so much wealth of insight that sits in there. So if you're thinking about using it, jump in. if you need a hand or want to talk about something, then come across to me at the Social Intelligence Lab and let me know, and we'll be able to find you some resources and ways to get started and things like that. But this is a discipline, it is an approach, and just don't be led by the technology is a good starting point.
Thank you very much, Julian. I think that summarizes, quite well. Encouraging people to get into this medium is also why I wanted to lead some of these webinars, because I think that social media data has sometimes had bad press, and it is a really useful source, and one which should be part of every researcher's toolkit. So thank you very much, Julian, and we'll go on to the Q&A now.
Thanks. Thank you.